All right, so this afternoon we've got the privilege of speaking with David Montgomery and Bikle. They are prolific authors, as you can see by the books in front of me, and have spent a lot of time and effort educating people on the benefits of healthy soil and all the different implications of that in many different facets. Their four books all get into that in slightly different ways. So awesome to have you joining us with Natalie and myself.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you.
Yeah.
Great. So at the beginning, could you give us a brief synopsis of what you might call your soil health journey? How did you kind of get into this whole field, and where has it all led you?
Boy, well, probably the real origin of it is back when I was an undergraduate in college. I picked up a book in the bargain bin at the university bookstore called Topsoil and Civilization. And I was a geology major. My professors were advising me, to ignore the soil because the interesting stuff was what was underneath. And I picked this book up because literally cost $1 and I needed something to read over the break. Read it and it was like, oh, soils are the foundation for civilization. It's an idea that's been around for a long time. And eventually that catalyzed me researching and writing the book Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations. Years later, once I'd become a professor and I'd gone on to study erosion more formally, it's sort of the here and now of geology is what shapes the land. And erosion is a big part of that. And in getting into researching the Dirt book, I really looked at the way societies have treated their land in the past, and what I thought I was writing was a history of soil erosion, and I ended up writing a history of farming, because that was the story, in terms of how society after society had quite literally farmed the fertility out of their land to the point where it impoverished their descendants. And in that book, it catalogs studies from around the world that have done that. And then the next sort of piece in this was that in the interim, I'd had the good fortune to marry Ann, and we basically bought a house in North Seattle. And she's a gardener, and she wanted a garden at this new house that had, a crappy yard with crappy soil. And she undertook it to really restore the soil in our yard. And so as I was finishing writing a book about the degradation of soils through history, she was restoring the soil in our yard and doing it at a pace that you just don't find in soil science journals in terms of how fast you can rebuild healthy, fertile soils. Because it takes nature a long time, centuries to make an inch of fertile soil. But if you already have the broken up rocks and mineral matter, you can add the biology back actually much faster. And that was the lesson I took from watching Anne and her regenerative gardening practices, which led us to write The Hidden Half of Nature. And then that led me into thinking about, well, could you do the same thing in restoring land on farms as Anne had done in our yard? That led to writing Growing a Revolution. And then the two of us had questions about, well, what might regenerative farming mean for what's getting into our food? How does the way we farm affect the nutrient density of what gets into us and thereby human health? And that led to writing What Your Food Ate. So Anne and I have been on sort of a long journey together looking into this stuff. We never imagined we'd be writing four books about soils when I started researching dirt. But it's been very educational, and it's fairly easy to assert that you know what I think is the dynamic part of these books is the integration of biology and geology, because that's really what makes for healthy, fertile soil. So it's really that this sort of little library that's sitting on your desk has been a collaborative effort between Ann and I for about the last, 10, 15 years as we kind of learned a bunch of different disciplines and applied her biology and my geology to the applied problem of thinking about how do you restore and rebuild the fertility of the world's farmland soils.
Yeah. Yeah. And, kind of unlike Dave, I didn't pick up a book that sounded kind of boring and thought, oh, wow, this is really interesting. My whole journey into this began, let's see, more as sort of a freak out and a hands-on experience. And and that was because, as David mentioned, I started building a garden at our first home in Seattle. And I'm a big plant person. That's where I have always connected with the natural world, with the things I can get my hands around and I can look at and I can eat and, very kind of real tactile kinds of things. And so my mind was on plants, it was on botany, it was on what would this garden look like. So there we were, I had done a good job of selecting all the plants and researching this, that, and the other. And then the day came to get the plants in the ground, and we went, oh, F. This soil is not what it should be. And are these plants going to die? I mean, what were we thinking? I mean, quite frankly, this is a huge point of embarrassment for the biologist and the geologist, right? The plants took over, and there we were looking at our dead dirt. So, yeah, I had done enough kind of gardening and growing of plants to know, well, it always seemed like in the past, if I could somehow lay my hands on a little bit of organic matter and at least get something on top of the soil, maybe this was a place to start. And it was. And it just kind of took off from there. And both David and I, from that point forward, began to ask questions and wonder a lot more about all of the things that live in soil, what they need, and how human activities either support that or detract from that. And that is a journey that can take you a lot of places.
And I guess the answers must not have been readily forthcoming to the point where you felt like you had to write the book on it yourself, to the point.
Well, the idea. One of the classes that Ann and I took together in graduate school was a soil science class,
Mhm.
and most of what we were taught about fertility related to the physics and chemistry of soils, which is all good stuff, right? I mean, it's important. But in watching Ann's gardening restore life to our yard, it really highlighted the role of biology and microbial ecology in particular. And so we kind of like recognize, hey, there's a bit of a gap in sort of our training and what we know, and it sits right in the interface between biology and geology. And I've always been an academic who's been interested in the interfaces between disciplines because that's often where, there's secrets of understanding and places to make advances by connecting what one discipline's ignoring that another one has discovered that's actually relevant to the first one. And we got sucked into writing about microbes because we realized that those are the things that were rebuilding the soil in our yard. So there was this sort of freshness for us of discovering, not new knowledge for humanity, but new knowledge for us in terms of what other people have figured out. And really, what I think our role is in writing these books is trying to connect the dots for ourselves and for other people, and to translate the stuff that's in scientific journals into English that people can understand.
Yeah, yeah.
Because we're trained as scientists, we're trained to write in a boring fashion for journals. I mean, editors will insist on that. And there's this one paragraph at the start of The Hidden Half of Nature that we highlighted that is straight out of, I forget, was it Journal Nature or something?
It's something.
Which, if you read it and you go, this is all like acronyms and it doesn't mean anything, and who could possibly understand it? But when you parse it and get into it, it was this incredible story about how the food we eat gets metabolized by microbes into things your body takes up that then bolsters your immune system and helps make you healthier. But you'd never get that as a layperson from just reading the scientific article, right? It's written in the priesthood ease.
Mhm.
So, a big motivation for us is to understand more than we knew at the start of a book. And each of the books has a point to it that is sort of essentially an argument that we're making based on drawing together science from multiple disciplines to shed light on something we think people should know more about.
Excellent. And could you walk us through each of them kind of in the chronological order that you worked on them? What were those points that you're trying to make? How much, what was the research? And, I know at least for Growing Revolution, you traveled quite a bit to meet a lot of people to put that together. What were those processes like?
Yeah, well, I may take on two of them and let Anne describe the two that she co-authored. But the with dirt, the one that sort of got us started in thinking about soils, um, really, I was very interested in writing sort of a broad sweep of history of how sort of superficial geology, the kind of geology I study, actually influenced human societies over, in the post-glacial world. Um, and the more I got into it, the more I dug into it, and the more I looked at the archaeological record and what's still written in soils around the world, the more I really realized that the history of humanity is in written in the soil that we've left behind, and that the basic lesson of that book is that societies that don't take care of their soil don't last. There's a very strong connection there. And the reason that's important today, of course, is that we don't have any fresh places to go. We're pretty much farming everywhere in the world that could be farmed over the long run, and we're degrading a lot of it at the same time. And so that got me sort of started to thinking about and worrying about what are we doing now relative to what societies in the past have done. But Dirt was a very backwards looking book. It's the kind of book you might expect a geologist to write about soils. It's a history of the last 10,000 years and how people have affected soils and how that in turn has affected societies throughout the ages. And then that set up looking into the hidden half of nature with Anne was explaining about how the gardening experiment that the garden project really motivated us to get into that. And maybe I'll let you do that, and then I'll go back and describe the growing revolution.
Sure. Yeah, so with the hidden half of nature, it was, as I had mentioned earlier, this kind of stemmed from an innocent question from Dave. Shortly after, the garden had been in for several years, and somebody came around and said, "Hey, have you ever thought about putting your garden in the neighborhood garden tour?" And he said, "No, what's the neighborhood garden tour?" So we put it in there, and I had to write up something for it. And of course, it was way too long, and Dave was reading it, and he said, "Have you ever thought about writing a book about the garden?" I said, "No, not until right now. Not until you mentioned it, and I was trying to write this thing up for the garden tour." So anyway,
that's my fault.
Yeah. So anyway, that got shortened up, but it really was the beginning of looking at soils and how soils function, and what makes them function normally and what makes them function abnormally, and it led us both to look into both the science and history around farming and agriculture, which Dave had covered some obviously in Dirt, but it also led us to this new area of science, which was just kind of exploding at this time, which would have been around 2015, 2016, and right before that as well. And this is microbiome science. And so at that time, research was coming out about the human microbiome, not so much the soil microbiome, because plant people had known about microbes and their beneficial relationships with plants for quite a long time. And you know how we are as human beings. It was like, wow, by the 2000s, wow, we have microbiota too? Oh, well, this is interesting. So all this research exploded, telling us that microbiomes, especially the communities in the human gut, were intimately involved with human health and well-being. And so we looked into science and history around also human health and microbes, and this led to some really cool stories in the hidden half of nature about Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch and this amazing woman biologist, Lynn Margulis, who was really onto the whole microbial story before others. So, the long and the short of it is we came to see these parallels between the soil and between the human gut in particular about acquiring and processing nutrients and these co-evolved symbiotic relationships, and how the tiniest creatures on Earth were absolutely essential to the health of plants and people. And that was kind of the story in the hidden half. And then Dave sort of took it a little bit deeper there with Growing a Revolution.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we noticed in writing the hidden half was that life literally came back to the yard as a result of all the composting and organic matter additions that Anne was doing, her regenerative gardening practices. And the color of the soil changed from like khaki to like a rich black kind of what we might intuit as really fertile soil. The organic matter content went from a couple percent up to almost 10% in the yards. So we saw huge changes in our yard. And the question that came up then, having written dirt and then seeing the changes in our yard, was, could we do this on farms? Could agriculture actually do the same kind of a thing and still grow enough food to feed everybody? And that's the question that we really started to dive into with Growing Revolution. And the way to do that was to go visit farmers who had done to their farms what Ann had done to our yard. And I had run into Gabe Brown and other farmers at some conferences. Yeah, when I wrote Dirt, I started getting invitations to go speak to farming conferences about the history of erosion. And that's where I started meeting regenerative farmers and listening. I was at the conference, so I'd listen into some of their talks, and I started to see, wow, some of these guys have done to their farms what Ann did to our yard. So I took literally about a 6-month period and started traveling around the world to visit farmers who had done this across the American Midwest and equatorial Africa and Central America up into Saskatchewan in Canada. Um, not quite our 51st state yet, I guess.
Natalie.
And what I started to realize was that there is a common set of principles that really can work to rebuild soil fertility remarkably fast, at least the way geologists measure time. And that those principles worked on small subsistence farms in Africa and Central America and large industrialized farms across North America. Now, of course, the practices were different. The technologies were different. The crops were different. The climate was different. The soils were different. But that the general principles that actually work to rebuild soil health seem to be universal and generalizable. And so that's what the theme of that book really became, is how can we actually look at farming in a way to build soil health? And there's really sort of two styles of disturbance to soil that contribute to the degradation of land over the long run. One is tillage, basically plowing that leaves the ground vulnerable to erosion by wind or rain. And if you're losing the soil itself, you're losing its fertility because the topsoil is on top, and that's where the erosion happens. You lose the best stuff first, in other words. And then also the degradation of soil organic matter is actually the other bit, because that, it turns out, is what feeds the microbes that Ann and I were writing about in Hidden Half of Nature. So these pieces all started coming together in thinking about, oh, well, what is it about regenerative farming practices that can turn the long-term degradation that past societies have imparted to their land around? And we started to realize that, well, it boils down to, minimize physical and chemical disturbance, keep the ground covered with plants that have living roots to put exudates into the soil, that they will exude organic compounds in to feed their microbial allies that we were writing about in the Hidden Half. And that a diversity of crops, whether in a rotation or all at once in a field in a glorious cacophonic mess, that actually supports communities of organisms in the soil that can partner with plants to enhance their ability to take up mineral micronutrients, to make phytochemicals. It basically bolsters their health and defense systems and serves as organic fertilizers in effect. And so Growing a Revolution really is what led us to realize that, oh, there is a style of farming that can actually do to the world's farms what Ann did to our yard. It's loosely termed regenerative farming, but basically what it boils down to are practices that build soil health. And there's lots of ways to do that. There's not a simple recipe. But it basically, when you think about what would it take to actually cultivate the beneficial organisms in the soil, you need to stop disturbing them, you need to feed them, and you need to give them partners to play with. And that boils down to no-till cover crops and diverse rotations. And then we had questions about what this all meant for human health, which I'll let Ann describe how we got into doing What Your Food Ate.
Yeah. What's interesting is that some people ask us, with regard to What Your Food Ate, the most recent book, why didn't you write this book first? Like, like this just all seems so obvious. To which we said, yeah, it is also obvious, but we did not see how obvious all of this was, until we were finished with, the preceding books.
I like to think that good ideas are those that in hindsight seem obvious.
Yeah, exactly. So, together, all of these books, we call them the Dirt trilogy, meaning that What Your Food Ate kind of rests on the other three. And it's true, like as much as we had learned about microbiomes, about the importance of organic matter, about those practices that Dave just mentioned, it led to the big question: what does this all mean for the human diet, for the plant and animal foods in the human diet? Do they have what they're supposed to have in them? And for things that are not supposed to be in these foods, are they there or not, and how come? And so what your food ate was really an exploration of taking a look at how farming practices affect food. So in other words, we were trying to start with soil and soil health and take a look at how is that rippling into crop health, animal health, and then human health. And I'll cut to the sort of the big takeaway here, and that is that in the end, what we realized, and this is all backed up by the research we did for What Your Food Ate, which I would say is probably the most intensely researched of all of the books, because, as I said, we're trying to link all of these things, and that's a hard thing to do, to go straight from soil health to human health. So it's sort of a bit like a puzzle. You've got to assemble your pieces and find how they fit together, and then build the big picture. And we came away realizing, wow, there seemed to be a group of things that farming practices profoundly influence, that need to be in plant and animal foods of the human diet. And we call these things the Fab Four. And they are micronutrients. So these are the things, this isn't anything new. People have known about micronutrients for a long time. It's all these mineral elements, stuff like copper, zinc, iron, that we need them in very small amounts in our diet, but they do big, big things. They kind of have an outsized effect in terms of their volume and density in our foods. And then the other thing, and this is where science is interesting. The history of many fields becomes like a ball and chain around that field. And I would say in the field of nutrition, one of the ball and chains is thinking about nutrients purely in terms of calories. And at that, the ceaseless, endless harping on fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. Because when you consider phytochemicals, so these are naturally produced plant compounds, they really don't have any caloric value. What they do have, though, is disease prevention value. And that is huge. And yet, you look into the history of nutrition and even modern research, and there's still this kind of ball and chain of the caloric nutrients. And so phytochemicals are hugely influenced by farming practices. And there's all kinds of science, all kinds of research across the biomedical sciences that show us why phytochemicals are important and how they integrate with human biology. And then also fat balance. Fats variously are the best kid on the block and the worst kid on the block. And really what it comes down to is the types of fats and their proportion in the diet. And one of the most researched areas is omega-6 and omega-3 fats. And so we go into that in quite a bit of detail in the book. And then there's the fourth Fab Four is this whole new area. Again, it's not really acknowledged in nutritional science, and that is microbial metabolites. So this is all of the things that the crop microbiome, all these microbiota, bacteria, fungi, viruses, all kinds of things in the soil, they're consuming this organic matter, or they're consuming plant exudates, and they're transforming their food, the microbial diet, either directly or indirectly into other things that either the crop takes back up, or, as in the case of humans, our gut microbiota are making microbial metabolites based on what we're eating, and then human cells can then take up these microbial metabolites. So one way or another, the Fab Four, the micronutrients, the fat balance, the phytochemicals, and the microbial metabolites are all influenced by farming practices. And here's the kicker. You cannot get sufficient amounts in the right proportion of the Fab Four in any other place except foods of the human diet, plant and animal. Yeah, there's supplements in a bottle, but we know they're never ever the same as how they come in a whole plant or animal food. So uh, this was sort of the big takeaway with what your food ate was, wow, here's all of these things that farming affects that are in the human diet that get into our bodies, and the diet is the only place to get them. This is why farming matters for human health in large part.
Or how one farms.
Yeah, how one farms.
Yeah, because the Fab Four are all things that we were able to show that farming practices impact. And it turns out that regenerative farming practices, the suite of
Yeah.
practices we were talking about earlier, tend to have a positive effect, whereas conventional ones have a negative effect.
Yeah, in essence, these regen techniques work, and they work to suffuse our plant and animal foods with all of the nutrients, and that's writ large definition of nutrients, with what is supposed to be in them. And this is largely modulated, facilitated because of microbiomes. So this is where the microbial world is not just a disease ridden, horrible place. It's actually, we need these communities of microbes in the soil and in our bodies.
Awesome. Well, that's a very good recap. And I'd like to dig a little bit into the microbiology in the soil and have you kind of explain the different functions that the microbes are doing. But I just want to give Natalie a chance if you have any questions or if you want to jump in at all before we kind of move into
The
that.
only thing that I ask for clarification on is when you say regenerative practices. So because that's so broad, and so sometimes
Yeah.
regenerative practices is just no till. And so I'm just curious if that is
Oh,
enough to move the needle, or if there's specific regenerative practices that we need to really look deeper into and include.
yeah, there's a lot of debate about just sort of what constitutes regenerative agriculture. And it's a term that hasn't probably been adequately defined in common usage. People are using it in different ways. Some people use and just say, if you just go no-till, it's regenerative. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not true. And there's lots of studies that back that up. What I found in writing Growing Revolution was that it was the combination of minimal or no-till, minimizing chemical and physical disturbance, along with keeping the ground covered, protected from erosion, and covered with cover crops when you weren't growing a cash crop, to produce more exudates, and then having a diversity of crops, which then also translates into different microbial communities in the soil. It was the combination of those three that really catalyzed rapid rebuilding of soil fertility. One of the things I also learned in writing Growing Revolution was that livestock can actually be an accelerant for soil building. Now, I had known in my PhD, I'd showed in my PhD research that livestock can degrade land.
Mhm.
There's plenty of examples of how poor grazing practices have degraded land around the world. But it was an eye-opener to me to visit ranches where cattle were being employed to regenerate soil fertility. And it's a different style of grazing, a different way of doing it, just like the different style of cropping can be regenerative. I tend to um, think of regenerative practices now as a big umbrella that covers suites of soil building farming practices. So in that sense, like biodynamic agriculture, that's regenerative. Agroecology is regenerative. The regenerative organic is regenerative.
Mhm.
But just going no-till is not necessarily regenerative. So if one is using a lot of herbicides in one's no-till, well, you're cutting erosion way down. That's a good start. It's a down payment. It's not actually achieving a regenerative style of agriculture. It's preventing the loss of the soil itself, but it's not doing that much to actually rebuild the biology. Now, that is kind of a loose definition in terms of practices that build soil health, but I like that because no two farms are the same.
Mhm.
And not every farmer is going to be growing the same crops, and they'll have different equipment, and they'll be selling into a different market. So, what kinds of rotations or cover crops, probably need to be tailored for the farm so it works for the farmer as well as for the land. But if we think of building soil health as the definitive aspect of what we call regenerative farming, we can use that to start trying to navigate, okay, what do we think actually is and what do we think actually isn't?
Love it. Thank you.
And the key there, as you're saying, building soil health would be, do you actually have a functional soil ecosystem? Correct.
Exactly.
And that is something
Exactly.
that is measurable and discernible, and you can actually gauge whether or not what you're doing is achieving that result.
Well, yeah, whether you'd have, you'll have an ecosystem in the soil no matter what you do to it, but it's just like a vacant lot in the middle of a city is an ecosystem. It's just a crappy one. Um,
Right.
so basically, if you have a soil ecosystem that's working for the farmer, working with, to support the health and vitality and production of crops, that's the soil ecosystem you want. And that was the big lesson we took from watching Ann transform our garden, is we started out with crap soil and we ended up with, really rich, fertile soil that, enabled the plants to achieve their full potential.
Yeah.
So when we think about, regenerative farming and how that's working, think about feeding the soil as essentially the way to generate that healthy ecosystem that will then go to put trillions of little farm hands to work for the farmer, trying to support yields and the health of the crops.
Yeah, I don't know how it is that it seems pretty clear to most people. I think certainly anybody with a newborn or an infant as a person moves through various stages of development, that diet is hugely important to normal growth and development, right? And yet, when it comes to plants, we throw that out the window. And with livestock, we think, can't matter that much. And yet, defensive systems, immune systems, ability to do all kinds of things is so dependent on, what are plants and animals eating. And so that's in part why we titled the latest book What Your Food Ate. We didn't title it, You Are What You Eat. We're trying to make the point that
Yeah.
it is foundational to our health what we're choosing to feed, crops and livestock that become a part of the human diet. It's what your food ate
Yeah,
that really is the beginning of the ripple effect on up into us.
yeah, we got to take that old adage one step back.
Mhm.
Or one step ahead, depending on how you think about it.
Yeah, and I love the clever twist on that title too.
Yeah.
So if we kind of unpack what the microbes are doing down there, let's start with kind of diving into the whole plant health side of things that we've kind of been covering already. But what are the microbes doing to make the plants healthy? What is the symbiotic relationship looking like? What are the plants contributing to the microbes? What are the microbes giving them in exchange? And you've talked a bit about this already, but maybe a couple specific examples of how that passes on all the way to human health.
Yeah. It's interesting, just these microbes and crops, or microbes and plants in a garden, or, the microbiome of wild plant communities. Uh, Here's what's kind of the bottom line on all of that. Everybody wants to eat and everybody needs to eat. And so the botanical world, clever, clever, clever. This is where all these exudates come in. And they have a monopoly on sunshine, plants. And so they can gin up just about anything based on the energy that they acquire through photosynthesis and their the fact that they're stuck in place. And so they rely a lot on chemicals and compounds. And so they make these nutritious exudates. People often talk about exudates as just being carbohydrates. I think that's kind of human centric, related to sugar and getting energy and stuff. And certainly carbohydrates are a part of exudates, but there's also fats in exudates. There's also proteins in exudates. There are also phytochemicals in exudates. So here we are. We have kind of the full buffet for the plant microbiome. And when a microbiome is well fed, you get really robust, accurate communication happening between a plant host and its microbiome. And you get microbiomes that are never malnourished, they're never going hungry, They're not going to start, looking around for some other plant to start up an association with. You want that. You want that relationship between microbiota and host, plant, animal, or human, to be really tight, right? You don't want somebody wandering off, because as soon as these microbes wander off or die or are killed off, the host is sitting there with, half a defense system, an immune system that, being stuck inside the host body, it all of a sudden is lacking really important information and communication that microbes previously brought to it. Information like, oh, I'm detecting a pathogenic virus. Oh, I'm detecting a pathogenic fungus here on the approach. You're already inside your cells. And so time to tee up the immune system to kick that pathogen out. And so when things begin to break down and falter, either through lack of proper, what I would call, proper nourishment for these microbiomes, the communication starts to falter. And once that microbial host communication starts to falter, all of the various cellular pathways involved in a normal immune response start to falter. And so it becomes, what was this really solid house starts to become more like a house of cards, and you knock one card out and another one falls, and then it becomes a little heap, and then there it is flat on the ground and dysfunctional. So that's kind of the big picture, and there's lots of little details to this in terms of the actual compounds that are being exchanged and what happens when they're missing or there's a little chemical change in one thing. That is endless fodder, really, for learning more about and investigating this tight linkage between hosts and their microbiomes.
Yeah, so a lot of it boils down to nutrient acquisition and then chemical signaling and defensive mechanisms.
Right. And here's one thing that's really interesting about all of this, all of these relationships and this communication, chemical and otherwise, is that biologists used to think, wow, evolution, that's really about, knocking heads. That's about how high-level predators are chasing prey around, and the cheetah that runs the fastest is the one that's going to persist in the population, and we're going to get ever and ever faster cheetahs. And it's true, that's certainly one part of evolution, but what has been entirely overlooked is, how is a single-celled organism like a bacterium ever going to survive on this planet by their lone, tiny little body? They're not. They would perish were it not for starting up, developing, and really hanging on to these symbiotic relationships with hosts. Symbioses, these are ancient relationships between life forms, not just microbes, but also larger life forms. I mean, this goes with, bees and flowers and things like that. So what we know is that these cooperative, mutually beneficial relationships, symbioses, are as much a driver of evolution as these, head-on conflicts. And biologists are always quick to point out, oh yeah, well, symbioses, those are, that's just any close association. Yeah, that's true. It's any close association, even like something between a parasite and a host. But the point here is that we've largely overlooked, until pretty recently, the power of these mutually beneficial relationships in helping, the microbes survive along with their host. You remove one and the other just falls apart.
And if you go back far enough in geologic history, partnerships with microbes are what allowed plants to colonize the continents. And so these are very ancient, deeply embedded in evolutionary trajectories for most of the organisms we know. And it seems like a lot of this, the cooperative elements of symbiosis, the mutualisms, are things that that microbiomes had developed in association with their host organisms, whether it's plants or people or water buffalo or whatever. And so one of the things that I've learned through this whole sort of journey in writing these books is that cooperation can be remarkably competitive.
True. That's
And,
right.
and I don't know why that should be a big surprise. Look at the human societies. We live in
Yeah.
villages and cities. We all have different jobs. There's there's lots of analogies one could make, but I think it's only recently that we started to think that like, wow, maybe this is another sort of root level evolutionary process in the
Mhm.
natural world that we've kind of overshadowed or overlooked for a long time. But it's the way that microbial relationships with host organisms, for the most part, seem to work. And then you get a pandemic and have, the bad actors come into play.
Yeah.
Yes.
But the bad actors shouldn't let us, ignore the broader
Yeah.
structure.
And this is part of the challenge, right? Our human brain loves to think in terms of black and white and simplicity. But here we've got these communities of microbes, and you find, a lot in the research that either it's incompletely understood, like, wow, we're finding these, pathogen populations amidst the what we know to be beneficial actors. So actually, this microbiome's got a little element of unhelpfulness, shall we call it, along with all of these helpful components. So how do we parse that? And the way I think about it is, you know what? Plants, animals, people, every organism throughout the history of life has always lived shoulder to shoulder with some pest or pathogen, right? It's
Mhm.
kind of that is just a reality. But what is another reality is you have robust immunity, a robust immune system. And this is, the human immune system, of course, is different than the plant immune system, but this is our defensive system. And if you support that, and this is where microbiomes come in, sure, there's some pests and pathogens there, but they never reach levels that are fatal. Never reach levels that are fatal. So you go on with your life and they're always there, but you never let them get the leg up. And that is what sort of, if you can keep pest and pathogen populations suppressed to, non-harmful levels, who cares if they're there, right? We're never going to obliterate every pest or pathogen or other life form that we perceive to be that way. There's just life
Well,
is way too vibrant and vital and quick moving to ever kill off, let's say, all the corn
well,
rootworms out
our,
there.
our efforts to do so simply make resistant pests. That's a whole nother
Mhm.
conversation.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. So in other words, the more the other thing this sort of journey through writing these books has shown me is that um, soil life, the human body, is incredibly dynamic, it's incredibly contextual, and it's very nimble and agile. And there's lots of feedbacks, and there's a pivot this way means a pivot that way. And so it's this whole milieu that is very quick moving, that it's the job of the farmer, the gardener, the eater to kind of honor that fundamental property in ways that always keep, you, the host, hopefully, on top of it all, and that it never gets so imbalanced that you're turning a situation around that is negative for you.
Mhm. Excellent. So I kind of I sort of think as three pillars, if you will, of what the microbial community is doing in the soil, and that health component, whether it's the plant health, the crop health, the animal health, human health, that follow through linkage is sort of one of those pillars. And another one is the soil structure, what the microbes are doing to build soil structure to make soils more resistant to erosion and these other detrimental things that go on. So could you explain a little bit how the microbes are building the soil and kind of the implications that has?
Yeah, when you look at soil structure, what you're really talking about is sort of how the pieces of the soil are related to each other. So in big part, it's what creates the glue that can get pieces of the soil to aggregate into what are called aggregates, surprisingly enough.
Mhm.
And it turns out that fungi play a huge role in that in many soil systems. And we go sort of into how they do it, but they themselves exude compounds that basically work to do that, and then their dead bodies actually turn out to be a whole lot of organic matter in the soil. So if you think of organic matter as part of soil structure, and a soil rich in organic matter can hold more water than a soil lower in organic matter, and it helps if there are void spaces that actually allow that water to move around and to sink down when it rains into the soil instead of running off over the surface. And that's where tillage actually plays a big role in degrading soil structure. So if we think about, you want a soil that's structured to have, a bunch of organic matter and void spaces, and the way you get that is by having these aggregates that hold their shape so water can move down in between them. And life is really what dominantly, plays a big role in creating those kind of structures. What happens when a plow comes through? Well, it churns it all up. It cuts the void spaces open. It slices the hyphae on the fungi, and it can powder the surface layer of the soil, which means that the next time it rains, that crusts up, and then the rain runs off over the surface instead of seeping down to where the roots are, where they can do good for the farmer and the crop. So soil structure is one of those elements of soil quality that plays into soil health. And again, there's different kinds of structures in different soils around the world. You wouldn't expect to see the same soils structures in, say, a vertisol in a California grassland or an oxisol down in Brazil. So it's very, again, contextually dependent. But life turns out, and life in the soil, both the microbial and the macro, in terms of worms and dung beetles and all those other kind of things that are down there doing their thing. It's life that really helps to structure soils in ways that facilitate the growth of plants. It's sort of a whole next level of mutualism if you look at sort of community organization.
Yeah. And on the topic of soil aggregates and getting good structure in soil, it's kind of a microcosm of the regenerative practices that we've talked about before. All this aggregation is a consequence of microbiomes that are well fed with crop exudates, well fed with physical organic matter. Because all of that is going to grow and support these microbial populations. And like Dave just said, this glomalin is the name of one of the compounds that mycorrhizal fungi make as a natural part of their biology. And this glomalin has a huge role in good soil aggregation. So, these microbes aren't down there thinking, wow, we really need to work on soil aggregation down here. This is really what this field needs. No, all these microbes are doing is consuming organic matter. And as a consequence of their consumption and metabolism of their preferred diet, the farmer, the gardener, the field is reaping this benefit of really nice soil structure that then delivers these, secondary benefits like Dave had talked about, which is water distribution and storage of water in the soil, something, I'm reminded of daily when I hear about all these wild thunderstorms and flash floods and so on happening in the South and mid-Atlantic states and so on. So to me, these regen practices, they just start to pile on in terms of positive consequences. And I'm really in favor, let me tell you, as a gardener, as kind of a hands-on person, if I can find one or two things and let those one or two things rip and have at it, and I get 10 to 15 other things that I don't have to really lift a finger to do, I'm all in favor of that kind of process, right? Because we're all looking to save labor, time, and so on. And so you do a few fundamental things and let it rip, and you can stand back and go, I like that. I really like that. And now I have time to go think up something else to do, or hey, maybe take a break, sit down.
Yeah, or think up something for me to do.
Yeah. Yeah, good. When I kind of first got into this, the concept that soil structure can help make the land resilient to both flooding and drought, the two extremes at the same time. It's one of these kind of mind-bending moments that again, like you were saying earlier, it's so obvious once you think about it. But it's not necessarily obvious when you say, oh, over here these farmers are dealing with too much water and it just runs off. Over here they don't have enough and it dries out. The same thing as the solution for both.
Right.
Yeah, and it's a little counterintuitive, right? Because when you think that if you're plowing, you're breaking the surface up, shouldn't that let water seep down into the soil?
Yeah.
Well, if you think about it that shallowly, yeah.
Mhm.
But it actually, it took a fair while for people to figure out that that wasn't really what was going on in most soils, and that it was actually counterproductive in terms of getting water down into the root zone of plants. So there's understanding how the system works really colors how we think about our manipulations of it should pan out. And if we have the wrong model in mind, we're going to get the wrong result.
Mhm. And is the soil structure is that's also important for the airflow within the
Oh,
soil too, correct?
Yep.
for sure. Right. And one thing we know, right? Guess where a lot of soil diseases, the kinds of conditions, the kind of habitat that some of these soil dwelling pathogens prefer. They like anaerobic, they like low oxygen
Mhm.
levels. So all this good soil aggregation keeps air moving through. And, part of the game of anything really, and this is just fundamental to kind of any place you're talking about, is you want to optimize habitat conditions for the species that you desire or that you want, right? So why in the heck we would make habitat conditions hospitable for pathogens, whether in the human body or the soil, I don't know. Like, we got enough of that going on in the world, the human world already. We know what comes from that. So I really think if we focus on taking what we know about what beneficial organisms in the soil and the body thrive under, those are the conditions that we need to be thinking about in farming and in the human diet and all of that kind of stuff.
Great. And then kind of the third pillar of soil health gets into what Dr. Lane Ingham famously described as the soil food web, and the idea that biodiversity, even looking beyond the food production, but now kind of almost on an ecological level, that biodiversity is sort of driven from the ground up, from the smallest members up. Could you kind of describe how that plays out in the soil?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the interesting things that has been uncovered relatively recently is that in a lot of soils, the majority of the organic matter that sticks around is from dead microbes. So if
Mm.
there's this huge, you can think of the soil as nature's recycling system, where you're basically taking dead stuff and turning it back into the raw materials to grow new stuff. And then the plants also photosynthesize and rocks break down and so forth. But there's this big wheel that's being turned. And it's the diversity of organisms that helps spin that wheel. And when you think about all the partnerships that we were talking about earlier with the symbioses between microbial life in the soil and plants, a plant, if it's some random seed that drops in a field somewhere, what are the odds it's going to have its best friend partner sitting right where it landed? The odds of that go up if you have a diversity of life in the soil. The number of potential allies that any particular plant or crop will have will increase. And so if we buy the idea that partnerships with soil life are important for plant health and for a style of farming that can help to minimize the use of agrochemicals and disturbance, then it's a diversity of organisms in the soil that really helps drive those connections and that allows them to actually be manifest. Um, and we saw in our own yard, the life came back to the yard in an order that really evolution of life on Earth, from microbes to then crawly things and mites in the soil to worms, and then the birds that ate the worms, then the eagles that ate the baby crows. We essentially assembled an ecosystem from scratch from feeding the microbes. So there is an element of sort of build it and they will come to the rippling of soil biodiversity to biodiversity above ground. But there's a whole bunch of other crap that we do above ground too that's going to influence that as well, obviously.
Yeah. I think I'm glad you brought up Elaine, because kind of ringing in my head is if you've heard Elaine talk, often we hear fungi, bacteria, nematodes, and protozoans, right? So
Mhm.
those are her kind of four major groups that she goes to when she talks about the soil food web. And I think about the soil food web in a sense, it, it's like the grand supply chain of life, right?
Mhm.
We've got some consumers of organic matter. They're getting what energy they need out of that. They're then excreting waste products, which is somebody else's, first rate dinner. And then they're consuming that and they're excreting something which is somebody else's first rate dinner. And so this is a supply chain of really nutrient acquisition that's based on nutrient transformation. And this is, we in biology, we often think about plants and plant life being the big foundation for animals, and especially for herbivores, right? All they do is eat plants. And then you get a nice population of herbivores, and then the cheetahs are in, all of the carnivores. And so you can think about the soil food web. It's not exactly herbivores and carnivores, but it's certainly these predator prey relationships. And I think these days, and then even thinking back to COVID days, boy, did we ever learn about what happens when you start jamming monkey wrenches into the supply chain, right? Stuff goes flying off left and right. Whole businesses get shut down. And this is why keeping that supply chain in the soil well fed, moving along, everybody's getting what they need. This is just, that is like the insurance policy on soil health, crop health, animal health, and human health. Because when everybody is getting what they need, everybody thrives. You
Mhm.
take out a piece of the supply chain, and then you've turned this wonderful, beautiful, robust system again, into something more like a house of cards that just begins to unravel and problems start, popping out everywhere.
So you've done a ton of academic research, gained firsthand experience, and traveled the globe seeing the results of farming for soil health. What has convinced you the most in all of that? And what do you think is the most convincing for someone who's skeptical or needs to understand soil health better before kind of believing in it? You have kind of the case studies, you have your own experience, you have the research, and obviously a blend of all three.
Yeah, what really got me starting to realize that the idea of prioritizing building soil health was the way we need to go across the board in farming was visiting farmers around the world who had essentially done that on a wide range of different kinds of farms, from subsistence farms to really, huge ranches and spreads in the American Midwest. And that they had basically used very similar principles in different ways with different practices, but the same guiding principles of minimizing chemical and physical disturbance, maximizing the ground cover, and maximizing the diversity of the crops one was growing, whether in a rotation or all at once. And then whether or not they introduced livestock in terms of more regenerative grazing practices as a way to accelerate soil building, seeing a huge range of practices all rooted in those same principles, and not just one of them, but the combination of all of them. That convinced me that that was a recipe for really rebuilding soil health and soil fertility, and that soil life was really the key to it. What really convinced me that this could actually catch on was that all those regenerative farmers I visited in Writing Growing a Revolution were more profitable than their conventional neighbors. And that's what turned me into an optimist on this because, if farming systems that don't sustain the farm are not going to be sustainable. And so what is it that made those regenerative farmers more profitable than their neighbors? Well, they were spending less on fertilizer, they were spending less on diesel, they were spending less on pesticides. Why? Because they didn't need them anymore. They weren't driving their tractors as much because they went no-till for the most part or low-till. They were and Yeah, their pest pressure was much lower than on their conventional neighbors. And after a couple year transition period, which was anywhere from about 1 to about 3 years in the farmers that I visited, their crop yields got back to the point of their conventional neighbors. And there's some studies of organic farming that show similar things where the longer one stays in organic relative to conventional, the so-called yield gap starts to close as soil health comes back. So you view those kind of patterns, and you see that, hey, we may really have something here that is both environmentally and economically attractive. And when you get those two things working in parallel, it's the recipe for rapid change and adoption. Now, again, I'm a geologist, so I view rapid change as over the next couple decades, we might be able to convert conventional farming to a more regenerative framework. But I've seen changes in the soils on farms happen where you start to notice it within a year or two, and after 10 years, it can be radical in terms of the actual regeneration of fertility.
Yeah. And I think what has convinced me is I'm a person who loves visual, physical proof. Something I can put my hands on and go, this is better or this is worse, right? We've all had failures in the kitchen and you just want to get rid of those, right? But we've also had these grand successes and you sit down to eat it or you can just sense it as you're cooking, like, oh, this is it. This is this is going to work out. And so in the setting of a farm or a garden, what has convinced me, and this has been in my own, my own gardening adventures, as well as when I go and see somebody else's garden. I usually keep my thoughts to myself if, I'm not seeing great stuff, right? You nod and keep walking. But here's the number one clue for me, and that is the vibrancy and the vitality of the plants that I'm looking at and that I'm moving through. And for example, I shop a lot at our local farmers market, and I can. There's nobody checking. How are these farmers growing their stuff? Some people have signs up that say it's organic. Some people have no signs, and so on. I can usually take a look at whatever is for sale and kind of get a sense of what these practices are on a given farm. And I'll usually see, you know, a little bit of some kind of stress, not like huge stress that makes you run the other direction from the food, but something. And then there's this one farmer that showed up recently, and you know what? Their stuff looks perfect. Perfect. And I'm like, that is not real. I don't know what those folks are doing, but I'm sensing maybe some use of something that might not be great for the soil microbiome when I see this sort of pristine looking stuff. And the eye can trick you, right? We want to think, oh yeah, that looks beautiful, I'm going to get that. But once you get an eye for, what has built the vitality and vibrancy of what you're about to eat, I kind of angle more toward something maybe with just a little bit of evidence of pests pushed off of the plant. And the other thing I really like in a personal situation is vibrancy, vitality in plants lead to their health. And to me, when plants are healthy, that means I do less as a gardener. I'm not fretting, I'm not fussing, I'm not thinking, oh no, what more can I do here? I need to intervene, I need some kind of a treatment here. No, the less you intervene, the less you, devise treatments for your crop or your farm. That also tells me that, yeah, this is convincing to me. And then, convincing others, that's always a hard, that can be a hard sell, I think, especially in these days with how prolific misinformation and bad information is. And you're always going to have some segment of the population that no matter what, they're just not going to be with you. And so what I like to work with and think about is that part of the population that still has an open mind. Sure, they have some skepticism, but they're open to some discovery or some new information. And instead of bombarding them with information, those are the kind of people, probably a lot like me, they want to see stuff that's real. And I think when it comes to farmers, one of the things that I've seen that's hugely beneficial and that I've always learned a lot from are farm schools. So this is where you have farmers that are doing practices that have achieved the results that can come from regenerative practices, and you bring other farmers out. And farmers, they're famous for, show me what you got. What does this look like on the ground? You can talk all you want, but till I see it in the field, I'm not buying it. So these farm schools, or gatherings of farmers that are doing education and communication about their own experiences, I think is one of the most compelling ways of sharing with others what is possible with regenerative practices.
Yeah, fantastic. And I love again how all those different things play off each other. It must have been tremendously gratifying for you to then do the research and realize that the science points in the same direction as what you were seeing through
I mean,
those
that's what's
experiments.
one of the things that's been very convincing for me for writing What Your Food Ate. I believe that we read, I think it was 1,000 peer-reviewed articles to basically draw from. So, our modus operandi in writing the books is to combine our own experience with historical analysis and experiences, but also to dig deep into the peer-reviewed literature to kind of go like, well, what do studies actually say about these kind of things? And then weave it all back together. But, as Ann was saying, one of the most convincing things is when you go out to see a farm that is actually has healthy, thriving soil and crops. And especially if you have an example either next door or in a corner that hasn't been treated in the same way, and you can look at the soils and go, this is different. That's convincing.
Yeah, I remember for What Your Food Ate, we visited two regenerative vegetable farms, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast. And the East Coast one, it was early June, and it was a somewhat drizzly day, and the light across the fields that day was just absolutely stunning. And I remember it was not only being able to really see the plants in this non-glary light, but it was also, you could get the full sweep of the diversity of crops they were growing out there. There must have been 10 or 15 different things, and you'd have, some cabbages next to some garlic, next to these beds of kale that looked like, out of some kind of dinosaur movie. I mean, the kale was just amazing. And everything, it just signaled health and fecundity and vibrancy. And that all added all up to me for health. And then the West Coast farm, on the other hand, oh my God, it was like, I don't know, it was in the 90s or something like that. And I'm looking out across Singing Frogs Farm, and I'm kind of getting the same sense as this other one. I'm seeing all of these different crops. I'm seeing these plants. I'm seeing these crops, these tomatoes, and even cauliflower. That is not really known as a hot weather crop, but this whole mixture of crops. And I can tell that these plants are holding their own despite the stress of the heat.
Mhm.
They are like, they had these tomatoes trellised in kind of a two-dimensional rows is a really efficient way to use space. And the trellising on those tomatoes was just sort of a part of the whole beauty and productivity that was going on. And so I see those kinds of things, and I'm just kind of blown away by the potential of plants when we give them half a chance, to really be a plant and exercise all of their potential with, their below ground systems and their above ground plant parts. That to me is really kind of rewarding and convincing too.
Awesome. So, last question. You have these four books here. It's been a while since the last one has come out, a few years at least. Do you have any plans for any more to add to the library?
Yeah, actually, I've just sent the manuscript off for a new book that's
Right.
provisionally entitled Regen, and it's about, you guessed it, regenerative agriculture. It's basically trying to synthesize what we've learned in writing the four that you've got on your desk. into a shorter book that's equally well supported by academic research. There's hundreds of references that will be stuffed in the back of the book. But basically, it's trying to look at making the case for why we need to think about prioritizing building soil health as the goal in agriculture across the board, whether you're an organic farmer, a conventional farmer, whatever style. That making regenerative practices in the sense of soil building practices more the norm rather than the exception in agriculture is where we need to go this century. And I'm confident we can do it. I've been on farms that have done it. I've seen farmers who have done it and been very successful at doing it. That said, there's no simple easy button for it. But there is a philosophy and there are principles, and that one can devise practices tailored to one's farm or garden to actually implement, and that it can leave the land better off and the farmer better off in terms of their economic situation. So I'm optimistic that these ideas will catch on because they seem to work. There's some fairly large impediments in terms of just the structure, the way that agriculture as a system is structured nationally and internationally. There's large impediments in terms of the organizations that make their living selling conventional fertilizers to farmers. That's a huge business. You can't expect them to lead the charge for change if the change will actually reduce the use of their products. But I'm optimistic that it'll catch on because it really seems to work. Now, I've seen a few failures, but one of the things that has characterized the really successful regenerative farmers of is that they're tinkerers. They try and figure out what will work on their farm, and it's not necessarily going to be what worked on somebody else's farm. And so, being curious and innovative pays dividends in this regard. Um, but I think that the bulk of farming will come along with this over time because we need to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels this century, and that runs the agrochemical business today, basically. We need different ways of thinking about how to farm, and there's good examples out there to follow. And I think prioritizing building soil health is the way to go. So that what I've tried to work up in the new book is the case for why that should be viewed as the future of agriculture. And it's not an argument for going back to medieval practices or, the kind of things that people will, characterize the idea of doing things differently sometimes. It's about integrating the ancient wisdom of things like cover crops and crop diversity and crop rotations into and merging that with modern science that allows us to do things like build no-till tractors and to actually think about more interesting rotations and to think about things like microbial inoculants to actually try and re-kickstart the biology in soils that have been degraded. There's lots of things that we can do to innovate around the idea of rebuilding soil health. But that needs to become the new North Star of agriculture, in my opinion.
Yeah, I sort of, I'm going to ask us a question right here, and it's how come we didn't start with this book? How come we started with dirt, right? Dirt lays out, really, if soils had a voice and we're writing the story, that is the book that is dirt, right? They're saying mistreatment, degradation, this has been going on and on and on. And I'm excited about this new book because I think it's soils finding their voice again and writing the story in a way that we humans begin to see that it's really up to us. It's kind of the call for a new ethos and a new way of thinking. And, you'll often hear at farming events, the biggest problem with this transition to regen, it's not my equipment, it's not the soil, it's what's between my ears. So in other words, these farmers are plainly and simply saying it's how we think about soil. So I'm excited, and I think there's been a number of, this movement, the soil health movement is, well out of the bag, right? And we want to push that along and suggest that, wow, it really is time for this whole shift in how we think. Because as soon as you shift your thinking, practices begin to line up with the shift in thinking.
Yep, and it's basically just nicely summarized the new book. But there's times when paradigms get sort of overthrown and shifted, and I think that in agriculture, enough science that connects the sort of microbial ecology and soil ecology to what we want out of farms has come to fruition, that it's time to reconsider sort of our overall operating framework. And yeah, that would involve thinking differently about the soil, having a new philosophy of farming that prioritizes soil health as the goal.
I want to put a plug in right now for Compost Extracts based on my personal experience. Okay, so this isn't some long running experiment, but I will tell you this: when I started the garden at our first home, and remember, the soil was bad, the plants are suffering, and roses are notorious for this fungal disease called black spot. And it looks just like what it sounds like. These black spots start appearing, circles all over the leaves, and you go, oh crap, I think that's black spot. And then you wonder, the leaves eventually die and they'll drop off, and then, oh, that's not any good because you're getting this black spot into the soil. And so I was playing around with a compost brewing system that I had at the time. And I also had a worm compost bin, and I thought, what the heck, I'm gonna give this a try and see what happens. So I'm digging through my worm compost bin. I'm filling up the sock type thing with that worm compost. I've let the water dechlorinate in the 5-gallon bucket, and I put the nutrient solution in and the aerator, and I get that all good. And this is why science is so fun. This giant, all this foam is coming, bubbling up. It smells nice. It's just a lot of fun. It's in the summertime. It's outside in the garage. Who cares that it overflowed? And I brew it up. And then I had this wonderful sprayer. It's a trombone style sprayer that I got from England, right? Because of course they have these things that they've been using for a long time, and it's a hand pump thing. Looks like these beautiful brass fittings and stuff like that. I'm like, okay, black spot, here we go. So I drench that with my compost tea, and I'm also, I'm spraying out 5 gallons of stuff on various other plants that my gardener's heart is just telling me, this needs a little juice. This is not looking good. And then, within about 2 or 3 days, the black spot is clearing up on these roses. Wow. And I'm like, wow, that is pretty cool. So I continued doing this with the roses over that summer, and the black spot is, virtually gone. And then, of course, you get lazy. So then I stopped using the compost extract. Guess what comes back? The black spot. So it was a way for me to see that, wow, this one thing that I'm doing has improved this situation. Now, do I know exactly why? No, I don't. But whatever was happening there was, controlling a pathogen that it wasn't really going to kill the roses, but boy, did they look crappy, right? And there's nothing a gardener hates more than a crappy looking plant. It's just not what you're after, okay? I'm not growing corn after corn after corn. You've seen one corn, you've seen them all. You got a few plants that look dumpy, and it's like the whole garden looks dumpy. So I'm not into that, and I want healthy plants. And so I really, there's something in my compost brew that was doing the trick there. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Cool stuff.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thanks so much for your time with us this afternoon. Learned a lot, and this will be a great addition to the project. And thank you also very much for all your contribution over the years, ongoing contribution to this field. It's really on the educational side. I think it's really making a big difference to have these well-researched, well-written books.
Yeah. Well, that's our aim. So good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, and thanks for helping publicizing the books. It's always good to get the word out.
Yeah, I think we're all in this together truly in a good way. So, yeah.
We are. Thank you. Appreciate you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank
Okay.
you.
All right.
Love.
Good afternoon.